Hey everyone, it's Natalie, and I am thrilled to bring you today my conversation with my neighbor, Catherine Coverdale, who is a partner biologist with the Xerces Society and NRCS. We actually talked back in September, and so I re-listened to our conversation, and we talk about a lot of stuff. We talk about programs that NRCS and Xerces do for pollinator plantings and weather stations. And we talk about her research for her master's, which was on blueberries and spotted-winged drosophila, which was cool because when I talked with Bernice about honeyberries, she was discussing the spotted-winged drosophila. So it was neat to get into the biology of SWD with Catherine. I hope you enjoy our conversation and maybe even take advantage of some of these programs that are out there to help farmers with some of these ecological practices to encourage native pollinators and the like.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rimol Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimol Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimolgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimol tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crops, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and much more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. We have been using a BCS tractor on our farm since 2014, and it has saved the day and leveled the workload more times than I can count. And I find new ways to employ it every single season. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. All right, enjoy the show.
Hey, Catherine.
Hey, Natalie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So this is my first in-person interview. And normally I'm in my closet, as I think folks who listen regularly know. So it's a little bit weird to be like actually making eye contact. But welcome to my house. Yeah, so we're in my house. We're in my kitchen.
It's awesome. I'm so happy to be here. We have a great view out the kitchen window too.
We do. It's lovely. And so this morning I was madly cleaning up my house, trying to present myself as a person who has order in my life. And Catherine came at 9 and we had talked about 9:30. And so it was really fantastic exposure therapy to letting people know that I live in a messy house. So thank you, Catherine. I feel much more relaxed now to just go ahead and have this conversation.
Yeah, this is great. I think messes are authentic and we need to all be real about that.
So the reason we could do this interview in person is because you actually live just right down the road from me. Welcome to the neighborhood. So glad to have you here. And just maybe tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name is Catherine Coverdale. I am a pollinator conservation and integrated pest management specialist for Xerces Society and a partner biologist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, in New Hampshire.
And how did you get into that? How did you get into insects? I'm always curious about people's sort of origin story.
Yeah, so I think my origin story kind of goes back to high school. That's where my love of the natural world was really sparked. I had an awesome teacher who I took some forestry classes with, and then my after-school activity was working in the woodlot and doing maple sugaring. He really taught me the value of working on the land, and I owe a lot of my love for nature and being part of something bigger than myself to him.
Was that in New Hampshire?
Yes, I went to Proctor Academy.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay. And so tell me about Xerces. You mentioned you work for Xerces Society, and that's one of those organizations I have heard mentioned for years now. And I just sort of have like broad word associations like pollinators, but I don't actually know what Xerces really does and what they are.
Yeah, so Xerces Society is an invertebrate conservation nonprofit. Our name comes from the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly known to go extinct in North America as a result of human activities. So its habitat was the sand dunes of San Francisco and the rapid development.
That's so tragic. I just kind of got chills.
Yeah.
Okay.
So our mission is to, protect our invertebrates, our special invertebrates from going extinct through habitat restoration, preservation. But we also do some other things like freshwater mussels, Be Better certification. There's like a really broad realm of Xerces Society. And I'm specifically on the pollinator team doing some on-the-ground conservation work there.
And how long has it been around?
Xerces Society has been around, I think, since the 90s.
Okay.
I don't know about that, though.
That's okay. We can fact check. Not
we
important.
Can fact check.
A while. Yeah. It's been around a while.
It has been.
And so you said you're a partner biologist with NRCS. Yes. And so this is great because I had a conversation during last podcast season with some NRCS soil health folks. And we were kind of breaking down the organizational structure of NRCS because I think if you're not in the government world, it's a little bit confusing. But tell me how you fit in with Xerces and NRCS.
That's a great question. It took me a little bit to figure out. I'm both because I help implement conservation with conservation planners through NRCS with the conservation lens of Xerces Society. So I specifically provide technical assistance for pollinator conservation and integrated pest management practices as part of that holistic conservation plan.
Gotcha. And you were saying before we started recording that you were sort of in a dash before the end of the fiscal year, which for the government is September 30th, to create or revise some of the programs that NRCS offers for farmers. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yes. So some of the practices that we are working on right now are the wildlife habitat plantings and adding some more practices under our pest management practice. So we have these broad practices, quote unquote, and underneath those for integrated pest management are activities that we can help farmers implement. And that includes things like trapping, scouting, monitoring, exclusion netting on high tunnels, sprayer calibration if people are spraying, weather stations, which is a great one.
Oh,
yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Weather stations are connected to NUA, the Network for Environment and Weather Applications, through Cornell. And they have pest models for insects and diseases. So having farmers put weather stations on their farm can really increase their precision of sprays, if they're doing sprays, or monitoring for pests that are showing up in their fields.
Yeah. So I think that's a really cool thing that people have been developing. Which diseases and pests are there models for?
Well, test my knowledge. Let's see.
Sorry.
No. That's great.
This is off script. I didn't tell you I was going to ask this because I didn't know we were going to talk about weather stations.
Oh, yeah. There are strawberry disease models, blueberry maggot, fire blight, apple scab. There are apple orchard insect pests like codling moth and plum curculio. And then there are also corn pests like corn earworm. There's a lot of others. I highly recommend people go to NUA at Cornell to check out those models. And if they don't have a specific model, they could possibly point you towards another extension that has the models. Like Fusarium head blight is an example that they don't have a model for, but they can point you to another place with a model that your weather station can help with precision there.
And so for the weather station, is that something that NRCS will actually pay for you to install a weather station on your farm? And what are the different variables that weather station is measuring?
Yes. So NRCS has payment rates. So we have kind of this set rate for implementing certain practices. It might fully pay for something in some cases and pay for a certain percentage in others. And what those weather stations are monitoring are things like leaf wetness, temperature, humidity, rainfall, and then they're calculating growing degree days based on all of that information, which is how they use the models for pest emergence or leaf wetness is for fire blight or something like that.
Yeah. So a lot of diseases and insects have a fairly predictable life cycle if you can input those different variables.
Yes, exactly. And what's great about the weather station is that you don't have to go out there and say, oh, it's 75 degrees, got to put that into my model. It's just constantly measuring all of those factors and putting it into that model for you.
Right. And so if you have your own weather station at your farm, you can go. And so I'm really interested in growing degree days because one of, I don't know, it's like a little pet thing for me is to use the sort of right units for what we're talking about. And so when we get, like, for example, a package of green beans and it says 65 days to maturity. It's like, well, 65 days under what conditions? Because it's really a certain number of growing degree days. It's like cumulative heat plus, water availability. And then some crops are also photosensitive as well. But so I really wish that seed packets would have on them growing degree days to maturity, because then you could factor in, okay, well, if I'm planting this in May, it's maybe not going to be 65 days to maturity, but if I'm planting it in July, it might be, but you can use growing degree days.
Right. Yeah, that's what's awesome. It's more precise. It's not like a classical pest management where, oh, we know this pest emerges on this date historically, which is not true in this changing climate. Things emerge later or earlier. So yeah, growing degree days increases your precision, and it's really important for management.
Yeah, that's so cool. And it's also from, I also love cover crops. And one of the things that I am curious about is using, obviously, a weather station is going to tell you what has already happened, but there's also at Cornell, and I can look up the website for it, but they have sort of historical averages for your area. And you can look at, well, how many growing degree days are left in the season? Like, do I have enough time to plant X crop? Or what is my likelihood that I will have enough time to get that to maturity? And from a cover crop perspective, okay, well, if I have, 900 growing degree days, well, that's probably a lot, 400 growing degree days left in the season, do I have time to plant a radish cover crop, or should I just go with my rye cover crop? And so it's more, that still is kind of date based on historical averages, but it's putting it in the growing degree day perspective, which I love. So, well, that was a fun tangent about weather stations.
Yeah, so important. Go get yourself a weather station.
What is do you know off the top of your head, the NRCS practice code for the weather station?
It's under 595.
595.
The weather station is considered one of the pest management activities. So it's under the pest management practice.
Gotcha. Okay. And pollinator plantings are under wildlife habitat.
Yes.
And are there other wildlife habitat other than pollinator plantings?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Okay. So I'm so excited you asked, because often when we think about pollinator plantings, It's that stereotypical meadow. Maybe it was an old field that you are transforming into a pollinator meadow. But there's so much other stuff that's good for pollinators. So at NRCS, we can do tree shrub plantings, and those have great early season bloom forage for pollinators. And shrubs they're honestly great because they have such a high floral density. So it's just so easy for pollinators to forage on trees and shrubs. Other practices actually include cover crop. We have a scenario or an activity under our cover cropping practice, which is 340. For beneficial insect and pollinator insectary strips.
Okay.
But you could definitely plant it in a bigger area. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind.
But is always targeting either pollinators or beneficial insects. There's no I don't know, other wildlife.
Yes, so a tree shrub planting also can be for wildlife food.
Oh, okay.
And we could just kind of think of wildlife food broadly.
Yeah.
So if a
like
shrub,
hickory nuts.
Yeah.
Okay.
If a shrub is fruit bearing, likely it's going to have great floral resources as well.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks for the clarification.
No, that's a great clarification.
So that brings me to another question, though, and I'm really testing your NRCS knowledge here. And you're doing awesome so far, by the way. You've been in this job, what, like a year?
8 months.
8 months.
Yes.
You're doing amazing.
Thanks.
So from personal experience, I know that having a diverse landscape that supports wildlife can also be a bummer when that wildlife comes and eats your crops. Mm-hmm. So is there wildlife exclusion opportunities in NRCS? Like how does NRCS support that coexistence when the reality is wildlife likes to eat vegetables and fruits and all that?
Totally. I'm glad you asked. We cannot, unfortunately, pay for wildlife exclusion. Because we're a conservation agency, we kind of have to take that approach for, wildlife is great. But we do hear from a lot of farmers, can you help us pay for fencing? Because that deer fencing that's a lot of material. It's really expensive. Unfortunately, we can't pay for that. But we do have other structures that could exclude wildlife. Not technically, but high tunnels. Yep. Caterpillar tunnels are one of the activities that we're going to be adding. Mm-hmm. So you can have exclusion material over those tunnels. Low tunnels is also a way to exclude wildlife. So we have some practices like that, but we don't have fencing.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if this is just a thought right now that I'm having. I'm wondering if you could get really creative and do like shrub barriers, sort of hedgerows. Do those actually keep wildlife out?
We do have hedgerow plantings, but I don't think that it's a great deterrent. Yeah. The deer will probably be like, extra things to munch on.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the pollinator plantings. I know when people sort of see an established pollinator planting and it looks so beautiful, but then the experience of actually trying to establish that kind of natural, diverse beauty that looks so easy, that's not the reality always of trying to get that going. It sometimes ends up as just weeds. So, what advice do you have in terms of sites, preparation, the plants that you choose, kind of the common pitfalls of getting those pollinator plantings established?
Yeah. The most common pitfall is definitely site preparation. Like you said, you need to be able to plant on bare soil for germination, and you have to have really great weed control so that you don't have too much competition for those early establishing plants. So we've seen this a lot, that people do really great site preparation with tarps or with herbicide or with a smother crop of buckwheat. And then they don't have good management. So it's one of those things. It's either site preparation wasn't that great or your first year or two of management wasn't that great.
And what are the management aspects, like water, weeding?
So
nutrition?
Not exactly watering. I would recommend a soil test before you plant somewhere, just to get a feel for what plants would work in what site. But the maintenance that we usually think of is mowing. So
gotcha.
In the first year, it's kind of counterintuitive. Maybe some of the annuals in your mix are coming up and you have some blooms, but we actually do want to mow the planting in the first year. So when your foliage, your flowers are reaching 12 to 18 inches, it's good to mow it down to 8 inches. Just because it's likely that some of that taller foliage is actually weeds.
Yep.
And you don't want them out competing those seeds. We say in the pollinator realm, for meadows, it's a sleep year, a creep year, and a leap year.
I have that written in my notes.
Oh my
I was
gosh.
totally going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, so often those perennial plants aren't going to come up until year 2 or 3, actually. So
like even when the seeds, they're just hanging out in the soil, not germinating, but they take a lot of germination cues, like a year's worth of germination cues to get going. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or they're coming up, but they're really putting a lot of their energy into their root development. Some of them get a little excited and they send up flowers, but probably that foliage is still, we want to make sure that foliage isn't getting outcompeted.
Okay.
So yeah, or the seeds are still down there waiting to germinate. They want their cold stratification. They have all these different things they're waiting for before they come up. And that's often why people think in the first year or two that they've failed because they don't see all the blooms that they planted that are in their mix.
And is that one reason too why you do recommend direct seeding versus trying to grow transplants? Because some of those seeds are just really finicky. Like, could we just, in the vegetable world, like instead of starting things by by direct seeding, sometimes we just grow them as transplants and then they have, a competitive advantage over the weeds. Why don't we do that with pollinator plantings?
We actually do have a scenario for transplant plugs, but we recommend that people purchase the plugs from a nursery, not do the transplant production themselves, because it does take a while. Some of them are pretty finicky. But when we talk about seeding, we really wanted it to be a fall seeding. And then for plugs, it's a spring planting. And it's just, I think a lot of it is the expense as well. Beyond the time, the seeds are still expensive, but less so than the plugs. And you can do a combination, but plugs definitely have the competitive advantage, like you said.
And if you choose to do the tree and shrub planting instead of the meadow-like planting, is that a fall or a spring recommended?
That depends. I think it depends on when you plant. So the bare root planting, I believe, is in the spring. And then in the fall, you would be planting potted trees. So it's just kind of these differences in like technical terms, what you're planting when, so that they are the most successful.
And this is exactly the kind of plan that you would help a farmer come up with. So if a farmer wanted to do a pollinator planting and work with NRCS to get financial assistance with that, they would work with someone like you to get the technical assistance to make that plan?
Sort of, yes. So that's where my role gets a little convoluted, I would say, is when you're working with NRCS, you'll get assigned a conservation planner. And if you are interested in pollinator or pest management activities, then they will likely reach out to me. So we will help do your plan together. It won't be just me because conservation planners are such a wealth of knowledge. They can do everything from forestry to agriculture, cover cropping, crop rotation, all of that jazz. And I can help, get a more intensive look at pollinator and pest management practices. So if you're in New Hampshire and you want to do some pest management or pollinator, I'll probably be involved. But there are also, I think we have 18 pollinator partner biologists through Xerces NRCS agreement across the country. So you might luck out and have someone in your area too.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about sort of the size and the distribution of pollinator plantings. Like how big of an area do you need to really be beneficial? And is it better to have one larger area or multiple distributed sites?
I think that's a great question. It depends. I think it depends on what you're able to do. I think anything helps, but if you do have a bigger piece of land, a bigger pollinator planting is great. They don't have to expend as much energy searching for the small patches if they have this feast, this large meadow that they can access that has a diversity of plants in it. So if you have a small home garden, if you're in an urban area, any season-long bloom that you can provide is really awesome. Just having that undisturbed habitat with pollen and nectar forage is lovely. But if you have a larger piece of land, having like a half-acre meadow is awesome. And you minimize the edge effect if you have a larger planting. So you'll have less creep of maybe some non-native grasses into that planting. They're more protected.
So then that raises another question for me. Is it better to do sort of a square or a long strip?
Probably a square.
Okay.
But again, it's all about what you can do.
Right.
If you have that strip, you have a lot more edge.
Yeah.
But that square kind of protects that middle from creep. And when I say creep, that can also be managed by mowing.
Sure.
So in your later years, like you can do a mow of 1/3 every year and alternate, and that helps prevent the creep of grasses into your planting or woody plants into your planting.
What are some common plants that you recommend in these pollinator plantings?
I think that's another.
I know there's no one size fits all. Yeah.
Some of the classic ones are Monarda, the bee balm, Echinacea, the Rudbeckias. For grasses, little blue stem in this area is really common. Or I think the Canada ryegrass.
I don't know that one.
Okay. Little blue stem is a really common bunch grass that's usually in the mix to add structure to the planting.
Gotcha.
And let's see what other ones. Partridge peas are pretty common because they have first year blooms. So it's kind of, it pops up and is like, hey, this was a success.
Don't give up on me.
Don't give up.
Okay.
And it's also self-seeding. So even though it's an annual, it'll likely come back again and again. Blanket flower, cone flower, oxeye sunflower. Those are all the classic ones that come to mind.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add about pollinator plantings?
I think I do want to just emphasize that site preparation is super important. I think that's when we see things fall apart. So I didn't get into detail, but
Get into detail.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's what this is for.
When you're tarping a site for pollinator planting, you really want to get that tarp in the beginning of the season and leave it on all year so that you're getting that good solarization throughout the season. And you don't want to till it after you've taken the tarp off because then you're just going to mix up that weed seed bank and you're going to get that nice flush again of your weeds. So we recommend that long season of tarping. And if you pull up that tarp and it looks like maybe it wasn't super effective, leave it on for another season. It's worth that time to have a successful pollinator planting. So
do you also recommend, so tarping, I think a lot of listeners are very familiar with tarping because this is, small scale organic production. Do you also recommend making sure the soil is moist, wet before, or not dry before you put the tarp on?
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Dry sites are kind of funky. I think they take longer they usually require the 2 seasons of tarping.
Yeah.
To really get that good control.
And maybe some kind of inventory of the weeds that you are dealing with at that site. Like if you have a pernicious perennial problem, then maybe a longer tarping.
Yeah, and that goes into site selection too. I think I really would avoid sites that have a persistent invasive weed problem. So like if you have knotweed or swallowwort or one of those other
yellow nutsedge does not respond to tarping.
Oh my gosh, any of those. It's just like you'll be fighting a losing battle. You'll invest in your seed and probably lose it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that definitely comes down to site selection. Don't choose those areas or get really good control, which might take 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Get really good control of those invasive species before planting something there.
And when you say tarping, the current recommendation is to use a black tarp, not clear, not solarization, but the black.
Right. And ideally like a black silage tarp, that really thick tarp that dairies use pretty often.
Yeah.
And make sure you have a really good seal on your edges. I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir about getting your edges sealed in here, but digging that trench and burying them or just having really good distribution of sandbags on the edges, that's super important. And then, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, making sure deer haven't poked holes in your tarps where weeds can come up.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, back to the show.
Let's move on to a little bit on IPM. So your job is sort of 2-part, like encouraging the beneficials and then discouraging the pests. So can you talk a little bit about your IPM position?
Yes. We have a really cool situation here in New Hampshire where our pest management program has been this really awesome collaboration between Cooperative Extension, the conservation districts, and NRCS. So we can have a really resilient program that better serves farmers in the state. So part of my job is keeping that collaboration alive and making sure that we're all working in concert to get pest management on the ground. So in our program, a lot of the things that we do are cultural controls. But we also recognize that there are some growers who still need to spray. So we do sprayer calibration to make sure that they're still doing precise sprays, reducing drift. And then not specifically under our 595 pest management practices are those pollinator and beneficial insect habitats. And it all really does work together to create this system that's more resilient.
So going back to those weather stations, how do the weather stations, or how can the weather stations factor into an integrated pest management plan?
Good question. Okay, so usually we have the weather station or sprayer calibration based on people's management styles as the first year practice, just to get you really set up for a strong IPM program. So that fits in to down the road informing your other activities that you might be doing under our pest management practice. So you can also have an activity on using the weather models to make decisions, where you keep track of what your high-risk days were or when peak flight was based on those models, and then what decision you made based on that. So that's another activity we have. It helps with your trapping and monitoring, when to put your traps out, how often to check them, when to put your exclusion netting on your low tunnels, that kind of thing. So you can get a high tunnel through our programs, but we also have some upgrades through the IPM practice, which I would like to say is also called Pest Management Conservation System on our end, but it's all the same. It all means the same thing. So the upgrades we can do for pest management are exclusion netting on the sides of your tunnels. And that, I'm sure you all know, comes along with some ventilation considerations. So we also do automatic roll-up sides, which is just a great labor saver as well.
Yeah.
And those are under the 595 practice. Other upgrades outside of pest management that do impact pest management are ridge vents for that.
The airflow.
For the airflow.
Okay.
So
that's a good point. When you say pest management, it is diseases and insects and weeds.
100%.
Yeah.
It's specifically diseases and weeds for us.
Okay.
I mean, sorry, not diseases and weeds. It's specifically diseases and insect pests for us.
And weeds would be more like integrated weed management.
Yeah, which we don't specifically do at NRCS, but some of our practices are also weed suppression.
Yeah.
Have weed suppression as a benefit.
Yeah.
But we're really focusing on those diseases and those insect pests. So if you are netting the sides of your high tunnel for, say, cucumber beetle exclusion is a big one, then all of a sudden you have some mildew issues in your tunnel, or rot or other disease pressure because of that airflow issue. So we understand that, and we want to address that with some improved airflow. And that's something that we would talk about before you net your sides of the tunnel. Like, do you have louvers? Do you have fans? What do you have going on already for airflow? Because it will impact how much airflow you're getting.
Anything else under the high tunnel or other programs?
Yeah, so for high tunnels, I like to say that you can also do low tunnels in there. Those are outside of the pest management practice as well. But if you are feeling a little, I don't really want to net the sides of my tunnel, that's a big commitment, you can, if you're not already doing it in there, you can get low tunnels with insect exclusion netting for some of your rows in there, which I think still makes a difference. Just because it's already a tunnel doesn't mean you can't put low tunnels in there. And I'm sure so many of you are doing that for season extension specifically. But if you want to try a new fabric like that, woven exclusion netting, that's a great opportunity.
So you, for your master's, studied spotted wing drosophila.
The big bad.
The big bad. Yeah. So I feel like a really bad friend because I didn't go to your defense or anything. So this is all going to be new to me. Tell me all about spotted wing Drosophila. What is it? Where did it come from? What did you do? What's the future of spotted wing Drosophila? Everything.
Okay. From the beginning.
And you can say SWD at this point.
Okay, great. Everybody, yeah, I'm sure you're all aware. Spotted wing Drosophila, SWD. So, specifically in New Hampshire, SWD showed up in 2012. It is a invasive fruit fly that targets small, soft-skinned fruits. So your peaches, your cherries, raspberries, blueberries. Those are the pretty common ones. It has a steak knife-like egg-laying organ. So it can cut through those ripe fruits, not rotten fruits like your classic fruit flies lay eggs in. So it can cut through the intact skin of those fruits.
And what is that part called?
It's an ovipositor.
The steak knife ovipositor.
Serrated ovipositor.
Serrated ovipositor. Nice. Okay.
Yeah. So they use that ovipositor to lay their eggs in some really perfectly marketable fruit. And then the larvae develop inside it, eat the flesh, and they can lay so many eggs per fruit, whereas things like blueberry maggot, they're only laying one egg per fruit. So it just really makes an impact. So I specifically studied the management of this in blueberries, just to really zone in on that.
So if you were to eat a blueberry, or if you were to find a ripe blueberry that had a lot of eggs in it, would you even know? Or do they have to hatch before you realize?
Oh, yes. If it's just eggs and not larvae, you probably won't know. So
extra protein.
Yeah. You won't even know. Don't think about it. Just eat your blueberries. Especially if you're getting them from somewhere that harvests really frequently and then puts it right into the fridge. They're gonna stop developing at that egg stage or their really early larval stage because of that cold.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So
actually stop. And then once you take them out, they're done. They're dead, or they've just stopped developing?
They've stopped developing.
Okay.
So keep your berries in the fridge.
Okay. That's going to be like the take-home message. Keep your berries in the fridge. Okay.
Tarp your plots and keep your berries in the fridge.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go to a pick your own berry spot and then you leave your berries on the counter for a few days, you're probably going to see some larvae crawling around. But that's really specifically if it's, August that you're picking berries. The early season berries tend to be a little bit less susceptible to infestation because they show up later.
Yeah, tell me about when they show up, the rest of their life cycle, all that.
Okay, so
where did they come from?
I would say, so they came from Southeast Asia.
Okay.
And they showed up in California first through shipping.
Okay.
And then they just rapidly made their way across the country.
And in Southeast Asia, do they have a natural predator?
Yes.
Okay.
So that, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
I know,
but I think that's
too interesting.
A future of spotted wing Drosophila is biological control in blueberries.
Okay.
So
we'll go back. We'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they have these serrated ovipositors. They lay their eggs in ripe berries.
Mm-hmm. Then the eggs are, 1 to 2 days, they're eggs. And then after that, they have 3 larval instars within the fruit. And they're just great at munching the fruits and making the fruit collapse in on itself because of their feeding. And they have mouth parts that kind of just scrape away and make it collapse. So once they hit their 3rd larval instar, they're probably going to be crawling out of the fruit. At this point, it's likely that the fruit has dropped to the ground because of its collapse. They're crawling out of the fruit to try and find a spot to pupate into the soil or right outside of the fruit on the soil surface. And then they emerge as adults right back up into the canopy if the fruit is left on the ground.
And how long does this whole process take?
It depends.
Or wait, is it a growing degree
gosh,
day?
it depends on the conditions.
Okay. Tell me more.
It's all about growing degree days.
Okay.
It can happen really quickly, like within just a few days, or up to 2 weeks if it's pretty cold.
Okay.
Growing degree days, they're so important.
Yeah.
So it happens really quickly. They have up to 13 generations a season, which is why it's so bad.
Wow.
Because their population just increases exponentially.
And that's in New Hampshire?
That's in New Hampshire.
Wow.
Yeah. So
where is SWD the biggest problem in the country?
I would say in places that have pretty big monocultures of soft-skinned fruits. So I know Oregon and Washington got hit pretty hard in the beginning because that was super early on. They had no management tools other than broad-spectrum insecticide.
Yeah.
So I think it's really those bigger operations that got hit the hardest. But now I'd say it's really the small scale, low to no spray operations that have the hardest time.
Yeah.
Because they don't have those pesticides as a tool.
Yeah. I remember in those early years of SWD, there was a blueberry place near us, high bush blueberries, and we got a bunch of blueberries, and my bad, we did not wash them before eating them. And both my mom and I were like, whoa, our mouths feel funny. And I think they had sprayed, some kind of neurotoxin insecticide. And I don't know, it was still there. The waiting period hadn't been long enough or whatever. But both of us were like, something's wrong with these berries.
Oh no, that's not good.
So
when you're spraying things, pay attention to reentry intervals and post-harvest intervals.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, I think in the early days though of SWD, it was really scary.
Yes. Yeah. This is people's livelihoods. They had to protect their investment. Probably they waited 3 to 5 years to get fruit on their trees. And yeah, it was just a really, really scary time. People lost their whole crop. And they were really heavily relying on back-to-back insecticide sprays. And in the beginning, there wasn't much rotation of modes of action. So that active ingredient, how it's impacting the insect. Now there's a few other tools that people are rotating their sprays, but still that's the biggest way people are managing spotted wing.
Yeah. So the fact that they have part of their life cycle in the soil leads me to my question about your research. And so you had some ideas about potential cultural controls for SWD. What did you do and what did you find?
Yes. So my research was specifically focused on weed mats, so tarping, and a peroxyacetic acid and hydrogen peroxide spray, which is typically a crop sanitizer or a greenhouse sanitizer. I was looking at black and white weed mats. And so those are the woven polyethylene mats. And products like Jet Ag and Oxidate. That's not sponsored.
It's okay.
And I found that there was better control there was less fruit infestation in the black weed mat plots, likely because the fruit that dropped down to the ground, that temperature was kind of cooking those larvae in the fruit or preventing the larvae from finding a pupating site on the soil. I didn't see, significant differences in the sprays, but I have heard anecdotally from growers, grape and blueberry, that they do get good control or control they're happy with.
Wait, did you say grapes are affected by SWD too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And especially because they're later in the season.
Yeah. Okay.
So that they're having good control.
I didn't know if their skin was soft enough, but it is.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
For sure. They're not the crunchy grapes we just ate.
Yeah, maybe we should eat some more for them.
Yeah, so they're happy with the level of control that they are getting from the crop sanitizer. And the way that works
Yes, mechanisms, please.
is the hydrogen peroxide and PAA, peroxyacetic acid, are killing the yeasts on the surface of the fruit. And the yeasts have these volatile organic compounds that are attractive to the flies. They're like, ooh, that smells good. I'm going to head over to that fruit with the yeast on it. And the females eat the yeast as a protein source for their reproduction.
That's so cool.
So it's kind of multifaceted where it's taking away that attractive compound and removing the protein source they need for fecundity.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so your regular old fruit flies are attracted to the decomposing smell of fruit,
Yes.
whatever those compounds are. But these fruit flies are attracted to the yeast.
And likely that the yeast is attractive to the regular fruit flies too. They just can't lay their eggs into those intact
serrated
fruits.
ovipositor.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Wow, this is very cool. Okay. So when you say the weed mats helped, tell me about the level of help. Like, is it enough? Can cultural weed mat control do the trick?
I think it depends on the market. So for organic, I think your customers they're okay with a little bit of damage. And if you're harvesting that quickly,
Put them in the fridge.
And putting them in the fridge, then I think there is pretty decent control. Obviously, it's just one of the tools in the toolbox. It extends, I think the fruit quality, stays better a little bit longer than just the regular mulched plots.
Mm-hmm.
But what was I gonna say?
100% control versus enough.
Oh, right. So when you're thinking about how to manage blueberries for spotted wing, you can't just throw a weed mat down and say it's good.
Mm-hmm.
There's other cultural controls that that IPM method of many tools in the toolbox, or the many little hammers approach of IWM applies to IPM 100%. And you want to do things like prune, select cultivars that are early season, frequent harvesting, sanitation by picking up dropped fruit, weed mats. Maybe your crop sanitizer spray is part of the toolbox for somebody who does spray. It's just all of those things together help with control.
So this is all for, cultivated high bush blueberries and grapes. What about wild blueberries? Do you know anything about what's happening in the wild blueberry world with SWD?
I think low bush blueberries do also have this problem, but I don't know as much about the management for that.
Well, so let's move on then to the future of SWD management and that potential for biological control.
Yeah, so in their native range of spotted wing Drosophila, there is a parasitoid wasp that specifically targets spotted wing Drosophila larvae and eggs in blueberries. It's that precise.
Wait. So this is a tiny
little wasp called Ganaspis brasiliensis.
Okay.
And it lays its eggs in spotted wing Drosophila larvae in blueberries.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And the little hole that the ovipositor makes, does that just heal over, or does that create kind of an entry for other diseases or whatever?
I don't know if it totally heals over. So the eggs have these little filaments, like these little breathing filaments that come out.
Oh my goodness.
If you have a microscope, you can see them.
Are they amazing?
It's so cool.
Wow.
I actually felt like such a professional when I could start seeing the filaments with my naked eye.
Whoa.
In the field. I was like, oh, wow, I've been looking at too many rotten fruits.
So you could pull a blueberry off a bush and find the filaments of the egg sticking out through the blueberry skin.
Yes.
And then would you eat it?
No, honestly, I went through a few year stint where I couldn't eat blueberries.
At all. That's
At
so
all.
sad.
So sad. Now I just throw them in the fridge and I think they're good. I'm over it.
Sorry, I distracted you. I was thinking about whether they have little holes in the blueberries. It's beside the point. But I was just thinking about how this tiny wasp gets into the blueberries.
Yeah, likely. I think it is that through that hole.
Okay, lays its eggs in the SWD eggs and parasitizes. Parasite? Is that the word? So the eggs are no longer viable. And then the wasp hatches.
Yes.
So when does the wasp come out, or do we eat the wasp eggs?
I think it is if the fruit has dropped to the ground, then the wasp will probably emerge from that fruit.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you throw your fruit in the fridge to kill your SWD and they've been parasitized, you're probably getting rid of the wasp too, but that's fine. And I do want to say that this Ganaspis brasiliensis, they've had some releases throughout the country. I actually got to rear some of them at UNH, which was really cool. But they are not commercially available and they're not widespread.
Yeah. So tell me about what kind of testing and models go on to make sure that a biological control does not itself become a problem.
Yes. So the Agricultural Research Service, or ARS, has a really strict protocol for releasing biological controls. So this process has been going on for years. We recently got a permit to rear them at UNH. I think it was a few years ago. And it's just a very, very strict protocol on testing. And that's why they specifically chose this parasitoid, is because it's so specialized. They want to make sure it's not outcompeting the native parasitoids because it has such a niche.
Okay. When do you think that they'll have all the data to feel confident? And is it the kind of thing where you have a planting of soft-skinned fruit and you buy a box, and then, it's just like every year you buy a box and you look at your weather station and you decide, okay, now's the time. Or if you're really good, you look at the blueberry and you look for the breathing tubes coming out, or what's the how would that work?
I'm not sure yet.
Yeah.
It's still very much in early stages of getting reared at universities. I'm not sure what the timeline would be for commercial availability. I think that it would be a while.
Yeah.
There are native parasitoids that do some work. But yeah, I think in the future, it would be kind of like your classical biological control where you purchase a tube or a box that has the eggs in them.
Yeah.
But I can't really speak to it yet. It's too early stages to say.
Yeah.
But it's the future.
Yeah, it's the future.
It's a tool in the toolbox.
But I think it's good that, there's a lot of testing and making sure that this is not going to disrupt the native species. So
yes, 100%. Yeah, they're really strict about that. This fruit fly is invasive, and we see the damage that it wreaks and the havoc that it wreaks. And they don't want to add another problem on top of that.
I wanted to rewind a little bit. I should have asked this before, but I know that one of the things about that NRCS is trying to change is to make their programs more accessible to growers on all scales. And so I know that, they're putting out like cover crop seeding rate recommendations on the square footage versus the acreage basis. And, just making those both the technical assistance and the financial assistance accessible with respect to these programs, the IPM and the pollinator work that you do. How are you making that accessible to small scale producers?
Great question. So for the pest management, we have scenarios that we use as payment rates, where there's a small farm scenario that it's a lump payment. And then there's an acreage scenario, which is better for the larger farms. So usually they come out, especially for something like a weather station or for trapping monitoring, they come out pretty even so that it's more accessible to the smaller farms. And then for low tunnels, like that scenario is square footage. Mm-hmm. And there is definitely coming around to be more accessible and make more of an impact for the smaller farms. I will say for the pollinator planting, we don't have a very small scale scenario yet, but our minimum is 1/10 of an acre.
But you still recommend using tarps for 1/10 of an acre to establish that?
That's what most people have done for 1/10 of an acre using tarps. But I feel like really large, like if you were doing a half-acre planting, that's probably not realistic and very expensive to tarp that much space. And if you are organic, no spray, the buckwheat smother crop scenario for a site preparation is probably more appropriate. Mm-hmm. But that's also kind of tough to do in something like an old field where you have to have really good control over that existing vegetation. The other option is herbicide, and that has worked out pretty well for the
it's
larger operation. It's amazing stuff. I will say, we do have this conversation quite a bit where it's a bit of a trade-off. You have one season of herbicide application, and then you have this long-lasting area that's benefiting pollinators and wildlife habitat. So, and I totally understand people aren't comfortable with that trade-off, but some people are, and that scenario works for them.
Yep. Yeah. It's nuanced. You have the one herbicide application versus the plastic waste. So it's hard. There's no obvious solution, more of a values choice.
Definitely. Yeah. It is a values choice. And there's also other options for, if you don't want to totally get rid of your existing vegetation and say you have an old hayfield or an old field, you could do something as simple as delayed mowing of your fields, which might, have some other forbs, flowering plants come up. You could do an interseeding of your existing field. And or a milkweed planting. Yeah, there's plenty of other options than just totally getting rid of a huge swath. But for each option, you do still have to have really good site preparation and make sure. So if you're planting plugs of milkweed into an old field, you have to make sure they don't get outcompeted for that year or two.
Cool. And we did have last season, I spoke with someone who was working with a group in Washington and out west, and they were looking at bioplastics. And so maybe there's a future of like truly biodegradable plastics as well. So anyway, well, do you have any final closing thoughts on anything that we've talked about? No. We pretty much covered it.
Contact your local NRCS office.
Yeah. Well, this was so awesome. I really appreciate it. And if I had to guess, I would say you've been doing your job for at least 5 years.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much.
You sound
makes me feel
very
better.
knowledgeable.
Oh my gosh. I'm figuring it out, you know.
All right. So to recap, everybody, refrigerate your berries, good site preparation. That's the real take home, right? And honestly, contact your NRCS.
Reach out to me if you have questions about what to plant in your area.
Yeah.
That's the other thing I do want to say is it matters what plants you put in what site.
Yeah.
You know? If it's a wet site, a sandy, loving, droughty plant will probably not be super happy. And swamp milkweed won't be happy in a sandy site.
Yeah. And the nice thing about these plantings is that unlike vegetables, which are, you know, a little picky and you maybe have to amend your site, like just choose the right plants. There are right plants. There are the right plants for just about any site, you know, low pH, high pH, sandy, wet, whatever. It's just you have to choose the right ones. It's so much fun to get to talk to all these delightful people. So thanks to Catherine for chatting with me and for helping me also with my exposure therapy and letting people know that I live in a messy house. It's a work in progress.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that episode. Always make sure to check the links in the show notes for how to follow our guests and hosts. The No-Till Market Garden podcast is a free show that is supported by folks like you who contribute every month over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. That support helps ensure all the shows we do, from the Seed Farmer podcast to the Winter Growers podcast, the Collaborative Farming podcast, the Composter podcast, Growers Daily, and of course, the No-Till Market Garden podcast, can continue to go and grow. You can also find books and hats as well as an active forum over at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge thank you to editor Michael Sellis and producer Jackson Roulette for all their work on this show and the rest of the team over at no-tillgrowers.com. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and make sure you are subscribed wherever you're hearing this so you don't miss the next episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. See you then.